Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jim Falk. Neither hot nor cold, the relationship between China and the United States seems more like really two rivals arm wrestling in a mud pit, with neither side able to gain a clear advantage, yet both are devoting considerable resources to gaining that competitive edge militarily, economically, and in the court of popular opinion. The relationship is puzzling, and that's why we continue here to devote so many programs to the subject. There really is no other country that has as much potential to impact our economy and security than China. Hearing a wide range of perspectives is vital as all of us have a large stake in the outcome. Over the last few months, the United States has dispatched several high-ranking U.S. officials to Beijing, and these include Secretary of State Tony Blinken and the Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen. Now, while all of this gives the illusion of tensions being dialed down, there's another side, and that is China's increasingly blatant hacking of high-level communications, recruiting of American spies, and apparent war planning of an attack on Taiwan. Now, our guest today is a person that some would say is a hawk. Dr. Jonathan Ward believes that we have become too complacent and that strong steps are required to counter China's rise. He's the founder and president of the Atlas organization. That's a consultancy that has actively and continues to advise the Pentagon and numerous Fortune 500 companies. He's also the author of the recently published book, The Decisive Decade, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. Welcome, Dr. Ward.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you.
So I can see right over your shoulder a copy of your book with that title standing out, The Decisive Decade. We are now getting very close to 2024. Why is this the decisive decade?
Well, Jim, I think this is the last decade in which the United States has absolute advantages over the People's Republic of China. And as I wrote in my first book, China's Vision of Victory, which was essentially a compendium of China's own strategy documents, their timeframes, their entire military, economic, diplomatic strategies, the history behind that, all in their own words and documents, which I'd done some work on as a PhD scholar at Oxford and then as an advisor to the Pentagon. We're competing against a state, the People's Republic of China and its ruling Communist Party of China, that have a very clear idea of how they're going to win a contest against the United States, how they're going to get there, what kind of timeframes exist. They have a symbolic date in the middle of this century called 2049, which would be the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And then they have a series of other symbolic dates going back to the present day, let's say. And for us, I think this is really about whether or not we're still in the game with a decisive advantage by 2030. I mean, this decade is the one in which many people predicted that they would surpass us economically, by some measures such as purchasing power parity. That has happened. By others, we're still far in the lead. It's when many of their key industrial strategies come to fruition. It's when many of their military modernization programs really come to fruition. So when I wrote China's Vision of Victory, which was released in 2019, very few people, I think, were aware of the nature of this problem. And today, as you've said, it's the sort of the talk of the town, and it's daily news, and everybody is very focused on what this means. So to me, having done research and impactful work on their side of the picture, I mean, what their strategy is, what's required now is for the U.S. to have an actual approach to this contest that will lead to us winning. And it is, I think, a win or lose contest. I mean, when one really understands what we're dealing with, I think that becomes true. And we don't yet have that. So that's what I outlined in The Decisive Decade. How do you dismantle the CCP's grand strategy, and how do you win a global contest for power with the People's Republic of China?
And you're certainly not alone with that concern, and there's probably no more astute observer of China than Henry Kissinger. In fact, God, isn't it amazing that he recently went there at 100 years old? And there's a quote in The Economist that I want to get your reaction to. Henry Kissinger said, "We are in the classic pre-World War I situation where neither side has much margin of political concession and in which any disturbance of the equilibrium can lead to catastrophic consequences." And we are seeing some testing on both parties. So what do you think of what Kissinger said?
Sure. And several years prior, he said that we are now in the foothills of a Cold War. So where this goes, whether it's a Cold War, whether it's an actual military conflict in Asia, I mean, I think this has a lot to do with the choices we make, but fundamentally we're dealing with an adversary that's made absolutely clear to us that they intend to go to war. I mean, that's the sort of thing that's been official rhetoric for years now, especially under Xi Jinping. You know, he's told us very consistently we're preparing to fight and win wars. This state, which is, I think, lost on many Americans because many Americans are watching the transition from, let's say, an era of an engagement where we were trading with China, not really concerned about the security risks, to now suddenly you have Xi Jinping. But if you look back to the beginning, to the Mao years, and the party is very consistent with how they see certain elements of the world, going back to the founding decades of the PRC. I mean, they fought wars with pretty much all of their neighbors. You know, they fought us in the Korean Peninsula. They fought the entire United Nations. They fought the Soviet Union. They fought India. They fought Vietnam.
Let me jump in because
multiple
I think
Taiwan Straits crises. So the point being, Jim, that you know, we're dealing with a place that has gone through the largest peacetime military buildup in you know, maybe the past 100 years, and has told us what their intent is. So when Kissinger's pointing this out, you know, it's really, in a sense, this is driven by China. And I think people need to understand that. That's where people need the background on how China's military buildup works, what their strategic geography
let me
looks like,
interject,
and what the
Jonathan.
history is.
Jonathan, hold on. Let me interject because I think you raise a really important point. When was it? 2001 that China entered the WTO, World Trade Organization? Were
Yes.
we duped? That's what I want to know. Should we have known more about China's strategy 15 years ago, or is it, you said, that there really has been a change in approach with Xi Jinping?
Well, I think there's actually an amazing consistency between, you know, as the party evolves over its past, you know, 75 years in power. So that's what we didn't understand, because I think the prevailing American idea was that economic engagement would bring China into the international system, create a responsible stakeholder. I mean, we believed that they would liberalize, and many people are on record verbatim saying that that's true, even as many are now saying, no, we didn't actually believe that. Well, they did. So so that was completely untrue. And yes, that was a lack of understanding of their strategy, but it was also, I think, you know, possible to see that it wasn't Mao's China anymore by 2001. On the other hand, you know, from a human rights perspective, and I think this is where we really lost the plot. I mean, we let economic interests and this sort of idea of a responsible stakeholder trump the fact that it was still, you know, committing human rights atrocities. I mean, the Tibet and Xinjiang at that time, that should have been clearly understood, was understood. You know, human rights dissidents were, you know, you have a series of gulags, you have organ harvesting, you have all these things that we should have taken more seriously. And you also have Tiananmen Square in 1989, which I think, you know, if we could have had a real turning point in how we looked at this, to realize that we're dealing with a very dangerous regime, and you know, it probably would have been knowable to understand their military planning, which a lot of the naval ambitions were designed in the 1980s. In fact, you know, that could have been clearer to us in the 90s, and certainly after the 1996 Taiwan Straits crisis, we should have asked ourselves, you know, where is it really going if we give them economic power? And that's what we did, Jim. That I think was the biggest mistake, was to basically bring them into the world economy with no strings attached, and then to enable them to become an economic superpower. And we have never dealt with an economic superpower as an adversary, not since the British Empire.
So if you had asked me 5, 6 years ago, you know, how do I see the competition with China, I would have primarily talked about the economy. But right now, it seems to me that there is a really serious threat of military action. I'd like you to tell our audience more about just how rapidly China has focused on its military, the amount of money they've spent, and what, now don't they have the largest Navy in the world?
Well, that's right. Yes, they do. I mean, they have the largest navy in the world by you know, surface ships, and you know, also the largest shipbuilding capacity. As our chief of naval operations recently said, they have about 13 or 14 shipyards. One of those shipyards can outproduce all of ours combined. And actually, multiple of those shipyards can outproduce all of ours combined. So they've built a military industrial base, a general industrial base, you know, which on one level is because we did economic engagement, because we had this global economy where manufacturing was, you know, moved in large part to a strategic adversary, which, by the way, is one of the greatest mistakes. I think historians will be amazed at that for, you know, generations into the future. But what they've done here is they've built, you know, they have the world's largest Navy, the largest Air Force in the Indo-Pacific, the largest ground forces in the Indo-Pacific, the world's largest strategic missile force, the world's not strategic, but general conventional missile force, and also the world's largest Coast Guard, which they use against their neighbors all the time. So when you hear about the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the Philippines, a lot of that is basically a Coast Guard that resembles a real Navy. So, and they have all of these territorial disputes, and that's where my PhD was on, the China-India border war and other territorial disputes in Asia, to give that context. But, these disputes have not gone away. And they've been, embarking on a major program of military modernization. I mean, some of that, we see the intellectual property theft that's allowed that. We see
Right.
technology transfer, even from Western corporations, that has fed into that in some part. And economic integration with the United States essentially transformed them into a superpower, and they have built a military that's designed for conflict in the Pacific and also to go and resolve in their favor some of the territorial disputes and conquests that they have in mind. So, this, and
Mm-hmm.
not the least of which is Taiwan, but Taiwan is also linked to the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the
Right.
island chains. You have a Himalayan border
Well, I want to be sure we have
contest with
time to.
India that's going on as
I want
well.
to be sure we have time to talk about your thesis, which is essentially economic containment. But before we do that, I'd like you to
Right.
briefly define for me, in an elevator speech, if you would, because these are terms that we're hearing all the time in the United States as well as around the world: de-risking, decoupling, and then what we've been hearing more recently from National Security Advisor, small yard, high fence.
Right. Okay. So all of these pertain to the economic contest. And it took a long time, I think, for people to realize that economics was going to be the central domain of this contest. I wrote about that in China's Vision of Victory because when you're studying the industrial policies, when you're studying the state-owned corporations, when you're seeing them worldwide, which I used to do in my travels, you see the big banks and construction companies. When you're looking at the Belt and Road, I mean, this is built by Chinese companies, funded by Chinese banks, in part backed inadvertently by our own investments and our own technology transfers. So to me, it's like the essence of the problem here. You have to go after the economy if you're serious about this, and you can't let them surpass us. And I think we're starting to see that in the policy community, a recognition that economics matters here. People talk about economic coercion, economic statecraft, geoeconomics, and then the idea of decoupling, which is basically, should we separate our economies? Can we separate our economies? I mean, on one hand, we have this large and actually growing volume of trade. We have a lot of integrated supply chains. Investment from there to here has largely been, sort of taken down by things like CFIUS, but investment from here to there is also significant. So you have a lot of economic integration, and you still have economic growth in China. So the idea of, can you separate this? Is that a viable strategy, or is that something that just happens on its own? Some people call that decoupling. De-risking is sort of a lighter word for a similar problem. Basically, can you take some of the risks out of this situation? And then you take, for instance, the Biden administration, which has kept the tariffs from the Trump administration on China, and has also, they did a flagship supply chain security review at the very beginning of the administration, which identified semiconductors, pharmaceuticals,
Right.
electric vehicle batteries, and critical minerals as supply chains that need to be de-risked. So the bottom line is removing some of that risk. I mean, the Europeans use de-risking now a little more than we do. It's essentially the same, a description of the same issue, which is how do we
And
handle
what about what
economic
Jake
integration?
Sullivan? Just tell us about what Jake Sullivan said.
Yeah, and high, high fence, small garden, I think, is a little catchphrase that says, "Hey, look, we'd like to have economic engagement with China, but there are a few things that pertain to national security, whether that be chips, whether that is artificial intelligence or quantum computing or anything like that, that we're going to have to put a very high fence around that. But we don't want to do the whole yard; we just want to do a little patch of the yard." And and where I would come in on this is rather different. In the decisive decade, I mean, as you mentioned, I mean, the strategy that I think we need to execute in the 2020s is one of economic containment. I think this is the last shot we get at containment. Containment was one of the greatest and most ingenious strategies that had ever been devised. It won the Cold War. It was passed along from George F. Kennan all the way through Reagan. 50 years worth of bipartisan consensus on how to contain the Soviet Union. But as many people, obviously point out, this is different. We have economies that are in close touch, even integration. So how would you do containment? Well, you have to start with economics. And it's really about taking a broader view. I think high fence, small garden, we will see that that does not work. I mean, I'm not going to waste any time on that because we'll just watch events show us that that's not the whole problem. You can't, you can't just separate AI. I mean, AI matters, and the
Yeah,
export
but
base is
Jonathan,
largely.
Jonathan, let me stop you here because you made the comparison with the Soviet Union. The big difference that I see is that China is a major trading partner for God knows how many countries. And so it's one thing if the United States places some form of sanctions and boycotts and so forth on China. But how are you going to stop Japan, the Philippines, Papua New Guinea? I mean, there's so many countries that truly are dependent on trade with China.
Sure, and that's going to be the nature of this game. I mean, that's really what this comes down to. I mean, to win this contest overall, it is going to be about winning a battle for global trade, putting the U.S. back into the top position on trade, on investment, on the reach of our companies into emerging markets. We don't have those strategies yet. China absolutely does. That's really what this comes down to, and it's going to start in many ways with slowing them down, making sure that their access to our economy, to our capital, to our technology, and to our markets, which really did create the China that we know today. I mean, it was access to the United States and our allies, which are still the majority of the world economy, that enabled the rise of China. That access is ours to give or to deny, and that's really what I think this is about. And then we have to go into the emerging markets where their fundamental strategy goes with the Belt and Road. I mean, we're going to have to outcompete them there. We're going to need our companies to win against Chinese state-owned and state-backed corporations. I mean, realizing that the companies are essential to this. I mean, it's as though, if we're going to talk about an economic contest or economic
But they have
containment or even economic warfare.
they have such a head start in Africa. And I also saw a phrase that just a few days ago that I hadn't seen before, and it was friendshoring. And essentially the concept of that is that trade or manufacturing that used to happen with China is now going to Vietnam or other countries in the Pacific. And so they're still dealing with China, and yet we can say, oh, we're working now with Vietnam or the Philippines. And so it's almost like, just sort of shifting marbles on the table.
Well, look, and the other side of this, of course, is the nations you've just mentioned are very much in the crosshairs of China's military strategy. So they all understand. I mean, they're even more acutely in this dilemma than we are. I mean, we trade with China, and we're also realizing that it's a place that's preparing for conflict with us and is designing a military for conflict with the United States in the Pacific. I mean, that goes double if you're Vietnam. I mean, that's their most recent war. And if you're the Philippines, you know exactly what they intend on doing. So their claims in the region are, always going to make nations take the U.S. side when possible. What we need to be able to do is to offer economic alternatives so that other countries can also de-risk, can also do a form of strategic decoupling that allows them to depend less on China. And if we can lead that, if we have a genuine economic strategy that allows us to regain our place, which we haven't lost yet, but which we're in the process of losing, but to regain our place as the real center of gravity in the world economy, then we have defeated their grand strategy completely. That's really what this is about. They see themselves as restoring, they call it the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, restoring their central position in the world. I mean, this is all built on ideas of a fallen nation that was humiliated, doing that through economic power and then having a military that can ensure their dominance of their region and ultimately more broadly. So we can stop that. But you stop that through a combination of economic containment, which I've laid out in the book, and also successful deterrence. And that's why the Decisive Decade is a grand strategy and not solely an economic strategy. Because if you only have an economic strategy, but you don't have a successful and viable approach to deterrence, then you're, I think in very dangerous waters. So we have to do both.
You said a few minutes ago that the Biden administration has continued to maintain some of the tariffs and other actions that were initiated in the Trump administration. We expect that, and we're continuing to see a ratcheting up of various restrictions and regulations as far as U.S. investments, venture capital funds, and so forth that can invest in China without getting approval of various regulatory authorities in the United States. My question to you is this: how dependent are U.S. companies on China for their income and shareholder value? And along those same lines, what about China's retaliation? I mean, couldn't they remove some of their investments from the United States? We know how much debt they hold of the United States. Don't we need to be more concerned about that? And with your views and also what we're seeing from the administration, are we not putting ourselves at risk?
Sure. I mean, they've already told us in certain ways how they're going to retaliate. I mean, I mentioned the book; it's chock full of companies, how they work, how they're, whether it's the Chinese side and how they exert control over their own corporations, or whether it's our side. I mean, many of our companies that are involved in their market, including in ways that are definitely, counter to our values and our own security and interests. Which is, that's just the state of play. That's where we are today. So they've told, mentioned, certain party members have mentioned specific companies that they would take action on in the China market. So I think corporate exposure to China is its own subject. And at this point, I think it really matters how Wall Street looks at this, because there are various forms of corporate exposure to China. I mean, one is assets, of course, revenue, profitability, supply chains, also the growth curve. I mean, if companies are selling a growth curve to Wall Street, I mean, that's pretty unrealistic at the dawn of, as Henry Kissinger said, the foothills of a new Cold War. Are you really going to open a new Starbucks every 9 hours, as Howard Schultz said, in an adversary state? Not that coffee is necessarily strategic, but it may not be the best, investment in a geopolitical environment like this. So I think when we start to see that shareholder capital is at risk based on corporate strategies that are probably not viable when they have contact with geopolitics, that's, I think, I'd like to see the companies in a way at the table, the way that we were, by the way, in World War II. I mean, that's a very important thing. I mean, we won the Second World War, and we also won the Cold War, in large part due to our private economy and to our business leaders. So right now, I think we need to get them on to the right side. That's incredibly important to an economic contest. You can't do it without them. But we also should have them thinking in terms of the national interest and realizing how they're putting their own companies at risk by doing this. So, to expect certain kinds of retaliation from China is by, I think that is true.
And,
And at the
and
same
they've
time,
not been and they've not been reticent. I mean, we've seen that with Australia, we've seen it with
sure.
Canada, and we're beginning to see it in the United States.
Well, we already know how that works. That's right. And then you have to look at exposure, sector by sector, company by company. It's different across the board. It's not just a blanket statement. I put in there that, Commerce Department statistics, as reported by multinationals, American multinationals worldwide, total profitability in China in 2019 or so was about $30 billion. I mean, that's not a giant amount of money. A lot of people
That
are
was really
pursuing the growth
interesting.
market.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. So when we look at this, I think it's actually a much less of a scary idea than we might expect. And the real growth markets for American companies are going to be worldwide.
But what
The
about
emerging markets are going to be incredibly important.
what about all the debt that China holds for the
Sure.
United
So they own
States?
about $1 trillion of our debt, which, in a country that is now over levered, more than 100%. I mean, that's not even, it's a lot less than five. It's not a big amount. I mean, the Japanese and the British hold an equal amount, and the vast majority is public debt. So I think that's a bit of a red herring. If we were to go after their export sector, which I think we need to do as an alliance system, then they would have, less of a sort of current account to reinvest in U.S. treasuries and that sort of thing. But I don't think that would affect liquidity in treasury markets. I mean, they're just too big and too many other countries need them. And if we start to trade with other countries, because that's the important thing, this is not just economic containment of China, it's a restructuring the world economy so that we're deeply engaged with many, many other nations. We start building those trading relationships and we start, opening our markets to other nations that we'd like to have on our side. I think you get a very different world economy, and one that will be in America's favor throughout the 21st century. But we're going to have to go through some difficulties at the beginning. And I don't think we should be afraid of that. And I think we need to understand the exposure in a detailed way, not in a broad strokes way. I mean, this is really about individual companies, individual sectors. How does that work? The current administration clearly has a technology sector where a lot of the exposure is. So I think that's already being brought into the limelight.
I'm going to interrupt you because we have just a few minutes left, and I really want
Sure.
to hear your thoughts about China's economy, because every day I'm reading different articles that either, now they're talking about the economy has stagnated. You're seeing deflation in China. They have a great deal of debt in real estate, et cetera, et cetera. How strong is China's economy?
Well, look, I think we're definitely seeing a softening in their economy, and we're seeing that across a lot of different indicators. I mean, yes, as you mentioned, high debt. Eventually, the demographics are going to kick in a significant way. That really happens in the 2030s more than now. The housing sector is obviously, has some real issues, and youth unemployment, all of that. But at the same time, I mean, there's still successful in a lot of very important strategic industries and emerging technologies. So I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. There's still a major economy. There's still growth in the Chinese economy. A lot of major investment banks are forecasting that at several times our own growth rates in the U.S. And I think that helps explain why companies have not pulled the plug on this, despite the obvious geopolitical risks. So again, I mean, we still have this problem of how do we go through disengagement that's to our advantage, that's done strategically and thoughtfully, and therefore holds the adversary back and allows some of their economic problems to compound in ways that hold them back strategically, which allows us to win the long Cold War.
One thing I do want to mention, Jonathan, in thanking you and telling our audience just how much experience you've had in China. I know that you speak Mandarin and you've spent a lot of time in the country and continue to do it. As we wrap up today's discussion, I can't help but think back to other programs, and we've done a number of them, on China. Where China is going and how the United States should respond are questions where there is certainly a wide range of opinion and perspectives. Recently, Harvard professor Stephen Walt wrote in Foreign Policy magazine that our policymakers should seek to reach a consensus on our strategy. So it strikes me that it's probably too early for that, because at this point, there's just too much uncertainty, suggesting that we are better served by gathering as much information as possible with the goal of preparing for the worst and continuing to work towards the best. Overreaction can be dangerous, and we've seen that in other instances with U.S. foreign policy, as failing to prepare properly. One thing is certain, the U.S. and China, as the two global powers while competitors, need to find common ground wherever possible. Thank you for watching and joining our conversation, where we talk about things that matter with people who care.